Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Ann Olnick Gumowitz, the Angelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan Gans Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the JoAnn and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Minard and Norton Garfinkle, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.
I'm Alexander Heffner, your host on The Open Mind. This is the first in a series of specials we're recording at the University of Southern California Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. As we inaugurate this Open Mind Roadshow, we're thrilled to welcome our first guest, civic luminary Austin Beutner, a Californian who's led a remarkable career in public life, a former deputy mayor of Los Angeles, Clinton administration aide and finance leader. The California-based Los Angeles Times publisher is committed to the paper's ongoing digital innovation, as well as to the broader mission to increase knowledge in our communities. In these efforts, the Times recently hired web impresario Nico Mille and partnered with Pulitzer Prize-winning director and author Jose Antonio Vargas to deepen its coverage of the immigration system. As our recent exchange with Knight Foundation President Alberto Ibargüen showed, the issues in contemporary journalism, especially the sustainability of a business formula that works, are as complex as they are unresolved. Our guest had the unique experience leading a team to help the former Soviet Union transition into a free market system, and thanks to a suggestion from our mutual friend that we explore his geopolitical insights, I had hoped first to ask Mr. Beutner how that experience has informed our own economic transformation, from analog to digital, from newspaper to web.
I'd say the greatest challenge from old to new is to start at new and work your way back. I think too many organizations, be they political organizations, be they countries like the former Soviet Union and the emerging Russia, or they be newspapers, start from the legacy and try to plan forward. What we're trying to do at the LA Times is start with the customer and work our way back. And to be truly digital, that's what we have to do.
And did that experience, to go back to the original question, inform how you view the change in our present media ecosystem?
Absolutely, absolutely.
How so?
Well, one of my experiences in Russia was a dispute with a leading government official over why business needed to make a profit. Well, it turns out that when you look at the literal definition of profit, there's the revenues less costs that we think of in America. But the only notion of profit they had in Russia, to a Russian linguist, was taking advantage of somebody. Well, you take advantage of somebody, made sense in their system. So I find just starting with the basics, making sure we're using the same language of communication, making sure that we understand a new set of ideals and how to translate them both literally and figuratively into what we do today. And I think that's a real baseline you have to start at.
And in your newsroom, do you find there to be a compatible language that's emerging?
We're working towards it. I'm 5 months in, unburdened by history, only modestly burdened by knowledge. And I find a good portion of each and every day is to ask some very basic questions and to see if we brought everybody along and if we are going in that same direction. It's a work in progress.
And what do you aspire to accomplish with that work in progress moving towards 2016? We'll have surely a heated presidential campaign. It appears to me, and now we're taping here in California, our home base is New York, that the political process, climate change, there are a set of issues, most daunting is immigration, that our country as a whole ought to tackle, and Americans think that we have to tackle. Is there a particular lens as a Californian you're looking at running the operation that is the Los Angeles Times today.
Yeah, well, let's look at immigration. We just announced a partnership with an award-winning journalist, Jose Antonio Vargas, to explore more fully the issues involved with becoming a diverse society. In Los Angeles, we're the most diverse big community in this country. We have 20-some-odd nations for whom the largest non-native population lives here in Los Angeles. So we've lived it for a decade or two. We are what America will become in another decade or two. So together with Jose, we're going to tell stories. We're going to listen to people who have lived that transition, explore what their lives look like, and share that. Now, it was interesting in the context of a highly contested statewide race in our last election, where each side saw polls that showed about 30% for one candidate, 30% for another candidate, 40% in the middle, in theory, undecided. I actually think if the polling could be done combined with truth serum, you'd find most of the undecided are actually uninformed and maybe not particularly caring. If we do our job right as journalists, we take that 40%, certainly they become informed. We do our job really well, they care. That drives them to the point where they're prepared to act, to engage in the body politic. And first and foremost, as journalists, our job has to be to make sure we act as that civic conscience for our community.
That civic conscience for our community. Those are a set of norms that newspapers historically were able to instill in the values, in the lifeblood of this country. That there was a way in which they were going to prioritize. There's a measles outbreak, that's on A1. Are we losing that spirit of civic consciousness in the way we consume and digest media, and especially given your own background in the public service sector, should we always be reading first as citizens, and therefore this idea of content, it must be, Austin, an anomaly to you?
Well, part of what we need to do as a business is to balance what customers will respond to digitally versus what and where they'll engage. We're never going to be about cat videos and water skiing squirrels in the LA Times. We just ran a story, a 4-part story on how produce was picked in Mexico, how it gets to tables in America. About half of the produce in America comes from farms in Mexico, certain types of produce. Well, it turns out we had reporters on the ground for almost 2 years. They came back with some powerful stories that these farms were virtually slave camps. Roll the clock forward just 2 short months. The Secretary of Agriculture in Mexico, together with several of the large buyers of produce in this country, just announced major reforms, providing for better working conditions, making sure the children there aren't actually in the fields but are going to schools, making sure they're taken care of, they have a health and sanitary environment in which to live and work. That civic conscience isn't about gathering the most clicks, but it is about doing our job and making sure that we're informed.
It reminds me of something Alberto Ibargüen said, which is that these news consumers, citizens of news, believe in the ethic, the value, the necessity, in fact, of Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting of the caliber that you're describing. But is there not a swath of your readership, or a swath of maybe not the LA Times subscriber, but the internet user, who is exploited as a result of the way in which the market has manifested itself online?
Yes, but I think that's there are pendulums in these, right? The pendulum is still swinging towards tonnage. Attract eyeballs, attract volume, and therein lies the promised land. Well, for certain types of businesses, perhaps it is. That's not ours. We're looking for engagement. We're looking for those who truly wish to be informed, and I think that's where the opportunity set is that we're looking to pursue. So the difference between just attracting attention and actually informing and engaging, and we're going to skew towards that latter.
And of those most loyal LA Times subscribers, what are the demands being placed on you?
They're looking for us to be, first and foremost, authentic, quality, integrity, to be right, to be provocative, to be informed. We've learned something. We relaunched the California section of our newspaper because we, first and foremost, need to own the conversation in the community in which we live. And one of the things we did was to unburden our journalists from this 500 to 700 word form factor. And words could be a proxy for shorter videos versus longer and so on. But what our data informed us from how our customers used or looked at our content online, if the x-axis were words and the y-axis was time of engagement, you'd see very high engagement around 100 words. Just tell me what happened. You'd see very high engagement, 1,000 plus, 2,000 words, an explainer. Answer as many of my questions as you can. The dead zone and the curve of engagement almost looks like a U is 500 to 700 words. Now, I don't think Steve Call at the Columbia School of Journalism is teaching people that 500 to 700 words is the optimum way to inform. It just turns out that 5 of those stories fit on a printed page. So there's a generation of editors in particular, not just journalists, who've been taught and trained that that's the right form factor. And so they took a 200-word story and they bulked it up to 500 words. And they took a fantastic 2,000-word explainer and cut it down to 700 words to satisfy the form factor. Well, we've turned that on its head to say, tell the story that tells it best. Be right. Or just put it out there and say what happened and come back to it at a later date. And that's really unburdened the way we're approaching our journalism.
And that's the tweet and then the extension of the long form, which has undergone something of a revival.
Yes, if people want to be informed, and we find engagement, by the way, that's not just your demographic of a newspaper reader who's older. We get tremendous engagement in our story in Mexico with millennials. So if you'll bring people content that is authentic, that is real, I see the pendulum's going to start to swing back. Brands will matter. Truth will matter. We've had a number of incidents in the public eye in the last 3, 4, 5 months where well-established organizations and some not so well-established organizations have not been paragons of virtue. We need to make sure, first and foremost, we stand for quality and integrity. In the long term, that's what our brand's about. In the long term, that's what our customer expects.
What do you think was the most corrupting influence in those cases to which you allude?
I think there's a healthy boundary between what is news and information and what's entertainment. Entertainment is cat videos. Entertainment is celebrity journalists. Entertainment is famous for being famous for the sake of being famous. News and information, sometimes it feels and looks like spinach, but that's the place on the plate that we wish to stay. And I think those boundaries in a shifting form factor as the world goes from an analog world and a linear world to digital and an ever-changing world, you need to make sure that you stay true to what you're about. And our brand is about quality and integrity.
And we have to be willing to digest the spinach, and whether it's a roasted or however you like it. I hear that analogy more and more because we want to spice things up. We want a little bit of cream, a dash of butter and whipped cream. But can we have it all and eat our cake too? Is there a tipping point here, or are you optimistic?
First of all, I'm the optimist, or I wouldn't have gone to work for a newspaper. Let's keep this in some perspective. But I do think spinach with a little bit of cream is fine. Let's not call cream in a cup with green dye there spinach. That's not spinach. And there are boundaries, and I think as those new boundaries are explored, one of the things we've done within the LA Times construct is to set up a group, a very senior group, whose job it is to maintain the journalistic integrity of everything we do across all platforms, across all form factors, whether that's someone's tweet in the middle of the night or somebody's 2,500-word piece that's an anchor in our Sunday newspaper.
A watchdog inside the watchdogs.
Correct.
Right.
And timely, though, because the form factor of print journalism where the freshness date may be days, weeks, months away, digital, it happens quick. So we need to make sure we are responsive and understanding what we're looking at.
Again, we referred to this briefly. There was the Sony episode of hacking, and that's been a pernicious influence. Not so long ago, President Obama convened a cybersecurity summit at Stanford University, which got a lot of attention. And he's continuing to balance what he views as the central responsibility of the chief executive of this country, which is our security, and the rights of journalists, of consumers online, their right to privacy. And I'm wondering how this conversation is being played out in your newsroom.
One of the challenges I think this administration and future administrations will face is think of it as private interests, private enterprise, an executive branch and a legislative branch. And right now, I see good dialogue between the executive branch and private enterprise, some listening being done to the interests and needs of the private individuals. I'm not exactly sure where the legislative branch sits in that. And as a practical matter, 20th century laws don't work in the 21st century. And the great challenge I see is bringing along the legislative branch to help write rules or adapt the rules that are in place to make more sense in today's world.
In one of the recent issues of the Columbia Journalism Review, there was a terrific matrix that was drawn to look at the formal guise and some of the informal tactics used to censor. And take us inside your newsroom, because when you write a controversial story, as it's perceived by the NSA, you, Austin, or your contemporaries in the legal counsel's office are going to get the call from the New York Times, and Jill Abramson and Bill Keller and others have written about their exchanges with the national security team. Has that come up thus far in your tenure at the LA Times?
Sure, and not just within the frame of what's government information. We had the Sony hack. And so very early on, a group of us got together and said, okay, what are the boundaries? Because there's a bunch of private information now in public hands. And we decided that we wouldn't share what was content effectively pirated, that we were not content pirates. So even though digitally available were previews, in effect, of some of their upcoming movie slate, we didn't share that. And we didn't share personal health and financial information, which again wound up in the public domain and maybe didn't belong there. We did share issues that had to do with the business of and affairs of Sony, the corporation, and that was the way we drew the boundaries as our responsibility as journalists and my responsibility as a publisher. I think the greater tension is in some of the more open platforms where even the boundaries about fair use of our content or other content maybe were created in a different environment. But the greater challenge will be for the digital platforms who don't have publishing guidelines in place.
They do view themselves as somewhat exempt from a journalistic code.
That's correct.
And I think you find that problematic.
Yeah, well, I find it problematic on a couple of scores. They do have a responsibility to the communities in which they live and the greater world that they're a part of. So you look at those and say, so what are they? Again, 20th century regulation or 20th century ideals around media don't apply. I think that's appropriate. I think that's fair. But to say no rules apply, I'm not so sure that's appropriate. Are we totally in this libertarian world where everyone can do whatever they want? I don't think so. So they do have a responsibility to the greater good, and over time, I hope it's embraced more fulsomely by some of those platforms.
I wanted to run through, from this CJR story, a few forms of the censorship matrix. So, of course, we've seen recently direct violence against journalists and what Alberto Barguin called a war on journalism, and the onslaught of a propaganda machine through ISIS. But, of course, there are still the stealthier forms of bribery, blocking or filtering content, and then, of course, electronic surveillance of journalists by the state. Are the efforts to censor or muzzle obvious, or are they more surreptitious?
I'd say two things I've noticed. I think censorship is there are more subtle ways in which it can be done through control of networks and access to data packets and things like that the average individual, either in that country or outside that country or whatever the suppressed area is less aware of. And I've noticed, and not unique, looking at ISIS, for instance, as a phenomenon where organizations or individuals have the ability to cast their own message, good, bad, or indifferent, in ways they never had before. So the open source tools, ubiquitous global distribution, you can put your bits and bytes out there to be had. And that's a fairly corrosive, or fairly powerful set of tools, depending upon what you think the outcomes are that those people seek.
It was noted again this year that our presence, the U.S., had declined in the Freedom of Press Index from the low 40s now to the high 40s. How do we get back to the basics here? How do we ensure that over the next decade we make it to the top 10?
This is America now you're talking
This is
about.
America. This is America. 49, I believe, in this 2015 survey.
I think the bigger pressure has been the commercial interests, which in general seek one voice or the other voice. Going back to my chart, 30% for something, 30% for something, or the other side of that, and 40% uninformed in the middle. Commerce to date has shown the bigger market opportunities are for either end of that spectrum. We hope there's plenty of place for those who honestly inform and engage in that middle. And I don't necessarily mean the political middle, I just mean between the two poles on any particular polarizing issue. And if there's been a decline in the independence and freedom of our press, I think in fair measure it's because of those commercial forces which take it in the directions of the poles.
There seems to be here more of a consensus that's emerged, and maybe that is because of your proximity to the ocean and the border, but and certainly the wildfires. But when you hear from readers on an issue like climate change, does the feedback you're getting seem to reflect something more common in mission than the polarized political right-left that you would see and think about as the viewers of an MSNBC or a Fox News?
Yeah, it's probably cast less in right and left and more into the substantive policy. And we have folks who are on either side of an issue like climate change in California and in Los Angeles. But on some of the larger tectonic plate shifts that this country is dealing with, immigration and the dramatic increase in diversity in our society, the environment, those are two things that we've lived now for a generation in Los Angeles. It wasn't necessarily forward thinking which got Angelenos to embrace a cleaner and more sustainable environment in which we live. It was toxic pollution. I gave a little talk on the environment a couple of weeks ago, and I went into the LA Times archive and pulled up photos from 1954, a woman walking down the street where you thought she might have been in a snowstorm. It was just pollution on the ground. 1980, Century City, you couldn't see one tower from the next. So necessity being the mother of invention, Los Angeles and writ large California went down a very aggressive path to make the environment in which we live more sustainable and leaving a better place behind for our kids and grandkids. That's become the example for the nation. The discussion about immigration, we are a tremendously diverse community in Los Angeles and in this state. That's how America will look. Exactly how we get to embracing everyone in our midst and what the benefits of that are, we need to lead that conversation. So on some of the bigger tectonic plate shifts, they've happened here. The deindustrialization of the economy, going from a third manufacturing, a quarter manufacturing, to preponderantly a service economy, that's happened. Aerospace industries moved other places in the world.
You have the distinct advantage of having been your city's job czar, and the way you speak with such richness about the texture of employment and the evolution here is compelling. I wonder if your peers, peer publishers and editors across the country, if they had that boots on the ground experience, if the dire economic realities of journalists would not have been different.
I don't look back. I get up in the morning, I go to work, and we're looking forward. This is an industry, the newspaper industry, that's thought about change as incremental. So 100% of something, if you move it 5%, that feels like a big change. Mm-hmm. But when you look from the outside, you say you're off by an order of magnitude, which means you need to be half as much or twice as much. That's my perspective, maybe a little different. And I think this is an industry that will benefit from not just my own set of experiences, but other folks, other owners, other leaders coming into the field of journalism, not just newspapers, and saying, in an ever-changing world, in a different world where the customer's behavior is different, how are we going to still be successful? How are we going to stay true to that civic conscience, which was our founding, but at the same time remain a viable commercial enterprise?
Finally, Austin, I want to ask you about encryption. Not to segue suddenly into another subject, but we delve very deeply into this conversation of how we protect journalists from government intrusion. I think very vividly about the Page One Times documentary and Jill Abramson's most recent comments about securing in a lockbox what the Guardian newspaper in Great Britain had delivered to her, which then the intelligence forces there had retrieved. What do you hear inside your newsroom about the importance of encrypting data? Because it's a two-way street, according to President Obama, if we want to still be able to access some minimal amount of information to protect our security. And I thought, as the former deputy mayor, you would have some particular insight into that question.
Sure. It's a complicated one because, first of all, most media organizations are not the cutting edge of all the data tools. Sony being a great example. For the media world, they probably had a fairly standard set of protections in place, but compared to a defense contractor, it would have looked like child's play. The same would be said for the LA Times. So we're not necessarily state of the art, nor will we ever be, because that's not a place we have the resources or the skill set to invest. So we're more likely a follower than a leader when it comes to the tools and technologies. But we absolutely recognize it's a two-way street, and we'll need to protect our own set of information, at the same time respect proper boundaries about what is in the public domain or what we may find through other means.
Austin Beutner, publisher of the Los Angeles Times, thank you so much for being on The Open Mind today.
Thank you, Alexander. My pleasure.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time for a thoughtful excursion into the world of ideas. Until then, keep an open mind. Please visit the Open Mind website at 13.org/openmind to view this program online or to access over 1,500 other Open Mind interviews. And do check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Open Mind TV for updates on future programming.
Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from Anne Olnick Gumowitz, the Angelson Family Foundation, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Joan Gans Cooney and Peter G. Peterson Fund, the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the JoAnn and Kenneth Wellner Foundation, Sally Minard and Norton Garfinkle, with special thanks to the Schumann Media Center for additional support, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.